The cold, metallic whisper of chains was Kais's first conscious thought, a grim lullaby in the suffocating darkness. The stone floor beneath him burned with an unnatural chill, an agony that seeped into his bones. When he tried to move iron, shackles bit into his wrists, a brutal testament to his new reality. Gone was the familiar scent of goats and his mother's freshly ground grain. That life, the simple existence in his hillside village where he'd chased nimble goats and helped, his family had ended 3 days ago. 3 days since they came. Like a biblical plague, the slave traders had swept through his settlement, their eyes practiced, their movements chillingly efficient as they harvested their human crop. He remembered the rough, indifferent hands that tore him from his family's hut, the raw, tearing fear as his mother's screams faded into the distance. Kais, a simple Celtic name given to him by his father, a legacy of generations, died that moment. He was no longer a boy with a name, but property, inventory, commodity to be assessed, priced, and sold. A flickering torchlight pierced the gloom, illuminating a man standing over him. He spoke Latin, his voice clipped and businesslike, devoid of any warmth. His fingers, surprisingly soft, threaded through Kais's hair, testing its quality as if it were fine silk. Then, a firm grip on his chin, tilting his head upwards, the torchlight dancing in his eyes as he meticulously studied the contours of Kais's face, his very bone structure. "This one will do well," the man declared, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for doubt. Beside him, a Greek man with calculating eyes nodded, scratching something onto a wax tablet. Celtic stock always brings premium prices.
Ow.
At that coloring, like spun gold and young enough to train properly, Kais didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He'd heard it before countless times, when his father sold livestock at the market, the same dispassionate appraisal of quality, the same discussion of value and potential. Except now, he was the livestock, and the market was Rome. A sprawling beast with an insatiable appetite for beauty that could be owned, controlled, and consumed. The journey to Rome blurred into a prolonged nightmare. Cramped wagons, the relentless jostle of the road, sparse, tasteless meals that barely kept hunger at bay, the constant, oppressive presence of other children, each sharing his incomprehensible fate. Some cried without cease, their sobs a raw, grating soundtrack to their despair. Others retreated into a terrifying silence, a void so profound they seemed to have died while still breathing, their eyes vacant, their spirits extinguished. A few, the ones who scared Kiss the most, had already begun to adapt. They mimicked Latin phrases from the guards, their young voices stumbling over foreign sounds, trying to curry favor with small, pathetic acts of submission. They were already changing, already becoming something else, something less human, but it was Rome. Itself, the infamous slave markets of the sprawling capital that truly unveiled the horror. This was no chaotic scramble, no desperate mob scene he might have imagined. It was organized, systematic, efficient, the markets dealing in what Romans called delicati. The delicate ones operated with the chilling precision of a military campaign and the meticulous aesthetics of an art gallery. The air hummed with a strange, unsettling energy, mixture of hushed reverence and predatory anticipation. Before the buyers, before the inspections, came the preparations. He was bathed first, scrubbed relentlessly until his skin was raw and pink, then oiled with exotic fragrances that made him smell like flowers he had never seen in his simple village. His hair was trimmed and styled by a man whose hands moved, with the practiced, impersonal efficiency of someone who had prepared hundreds of boys for sale. He was dressed in a simple, pristine white tunic, a deliberate costume designed to emphasize his youth and innocence. Crafted to trigger specific desires in potential buyers, the inspection process itself was methodical, intimate and profoundly humiliating. Buyers circled him like hungry wolves, their eyes sharp, dissecting him with their gaze. They discussed his merits and flaws in voices that made no attempt to acknowledge his humanity. His teeth were examined, like a horse. His skin was scrutinized for blemishes. The proportions of his limbs were measured with the same cold attention. A sculptor might give to a piece of marble, Some spoke to him in broken Celtic, testing his comprehension. Whether he was quick-witted enough to grasp basic instructions, others were more interested in his emotional responses, how he reacted to touch, whether he flinched or submitted if tears came easily, or if he had already learned the bitter lesson of hiding them. Marcus Lucallus was the one who eventually purchased him. He was a man in his 40s, soft around the middle from a life of indulgence, but with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He examined Kai's with the thoroughness of a connoisseur, his hands tracing the lines of his arms and shoulders, tilting his face towards the flickering light, studying his features from different angles. When he finally spoke to the dealer, his voice carried the casual authority of someone accustomed to acquiring whatever struck his fancy. "How old?" he asked, though he had clearly already made his assessment. 12, maybe 13, the dealer replied smoothly, a practiced smile on his lips. "Young enough to train properly, old enough to be interesting. And look at this bone structure. He'll age beautifully for several years before you need to think about replacement." The casual, almost throwaway mention of his inevitable disposal hit Kai's like a physical blow. He wasn't just being sold into slavery. He was being sold into a system with a built-in expiration date. A chilling realization that his value would inevitably decline, and his usefulness would end. But even this pained understanding paled beside the growing, its unspoken dread of what his specific role would truly entail. The transaction completed with the mundane, its efficiency of buying bread. Money changed hands, ownership papers were signed, and suddenly Kais belonged to Marcus Lucalis, as completely as his toga or his sandals. Lucalis didn't speak to him directly. Slaves didn't merit conversation. Instead, he gave instructions to a well-dressed older man who would oversee Kais's transport to his new home. The villa that would become Kais's world was more beautiful than anything he could have imagined in his village life. Marble floors inlaid with intricate mosaics, walls painted with vibrant scenes from mythology. Gardens where exotic plants filled the air with perfumes that made his head swim, but the beauty quickly became sinister. Every lovely detail, every opulent decoration was part of an elaborate stage set where he would perform a role he never auditioned for, apart from which there was no escape. Kais's new life, now devoid of his name and past, began within the opulent, yet suffocating, confines of the villa. His education commenced immediately, a brutal reprogramming unlike anything he had ever known. Alexandros, the man overseeing. His transformation moved with the detached efficiency of a sculptor molding clay. He himself was a former favorite of Lucalis. His own youthful beauty faded, but his position secured through his indispensable management of his master's collection of beautiful boys. Alexandros was not cruel, but his kindness carried the cold. Professionalism of someone who had learned to survive by severing all. Emotional attachments to those who would inevitably be replaced. "The master prefers intelligent conversation," he explained, his voice flat as he outlined the grueling daily schedule. "You'll study Greek philosophy, Roman poetry, basic arithmetic, and musical performance." His body, Alexandros stressed, must remain pleasing. "We will control your diet carefully. You'll bathe twice daily with oils that keep your skin soft." Most importantly, he would learn deportment, how to walk, how to sit, how to lower his eyes at the right moment, how to appear attentive without seeming to listen when the master discussed business with his guests. The lessons were exhaustive, designed to strip away his former identity and replace it with a perfectly compliant facade. Mornings were dedicated to language instruction, not just Latin and Greek, but the subtle differences in tone and vocabulary appropriate for different social situations. He learned specific ways to address senators versus merchants, particular phrases that showed respect without appearing servile. Careful modulations of voice that suggested intelligence without threatening his. Master's intellectual superiority, afternoons, were devoted to cultural education. He memorized vast passages of poetry, not because he found them beautiful, though some were, but because he might be called upon to recite them for his master's entertainment. He studied the myths behind the intricate artwork decorating the villa, learning to discuss symbolic meanings while carefully avoiding any interpretation that might make him seem too scholarly or independent. Music lessons followed, and here, in the gentle strum of the lyre, Kais found a small, unexpected refuge. The instrument responded to his touch with sounds that for a few precious moments each day briefly transported him beyond the marble walls. He could lose himself in melodies that had no purpose beyond their own beauty. But even this sanctuary was compromised. For every song he learned was chosen for its potential to please his master's ears during intimate moments. Physical conditioning formed another crucial part of his training, though it was unlike any exercise he had known. There was no development of strength or endurance. Instead, every effort focused on maintaining the soft, androgynous beauty his master had prized at the market. His diet was meticulously controlled to prevent the muscle development that would mark his transition into manhood. Herbs were added to his food, specialized oils rubbed into his skin, and treatments administered by physicians who specialized in preserving youthful appearance, delaying the inevitable march of time that would diminish his value. The psychological conditioning proved more subtle and far more devastating than the physical training. Slowly, methodically, his trainers eroded his sense of independent identity. His birth name was forbidden. He was now called Ganymede, after Zeus's beautiful cupbearer, a name that redefined his existence as a mythic object of desire. His memories of home were dismissed as irrelevant fantasies. His former life was described as a fleeting dream from which he had awakened into his true reality. Most insidiously, he was taught that his value as a human being depended entirely on his ability to please his master. Success meant maintaining beauty, youth, and perfect submission. Failure meant not just punishment, but complete worthlessness. This message was reinforced constantly through lavish rewards for compliance and subtle, yet unmistakable threats for resistance. The other boys in the household became both companions and competitors. Bound by their shared captivity, yet subtly pitted against each other. There was Alexis, a Syrian boy with dark, intelligent eyes, who had arrived 6 months before Ganymede and had learned to navigate the system with frightening skill. Alexis taught him the techniques for applying cosmetics to enhance his natural coloring, the particular ways their master liked his wine mixed. He warned Ganymede about the questions he should never ask and the topics he should never raise, a silent pact of survival. Then there was Dionysius, a Greek boy who had been in the household for 3 years. He moved through the villa like a ghost, beautiful, but somehow absent, responding to commands with perfect obedience, yet showing no spark of individual personality. The other boys whispered that he was what happened when someone surrendered completely to the system, still functional, still valuable, but no longer entirely human. Ganymede's first private summons came 3 weeks after his arrival. Spent the entire day preparing him, selecting the perfect tunic to emphasize his slender build, arranging his hair to catch the lamplight, applying subtle cosmetics that enhanced his youth without appearing artificial. He coached Ganymede on proper behavior, how to enter the room, where to position himself, how to respond to commands without seeming eager or reluctant.
Outnumber,
Alexandra said, making final adjustments to his appearance. His voice a low, chilling whisper, "You exist for his pleasure. Your thoughts, your feelings, your desires, none of these matter. What matters is that you provide whatever he needs in this moment. Sometimes that's conversation, sometimes silent companionship, sometimes more intimate service. Your job is to sense what he wants and provide it before he has to ask." The walk to his master's private chambers felt endless, though it was only the length of a corridor. His bare feet made no sound on the marble, but his heart pounded so loudly he was certain everyone in the villa could hear it. The guards at the door stepped aside without acknowledgement. It was not significant enough to merit their attention. And suddenly, he was alone with the man who owned him completely. Marcus Lucullus reclined on a couch upholstered in silk, cup of wine in his hand, scrolls scattered around him, suggesting he had been reading. He had removed his formal toga and wore only a simple tunic, but the casual dress did not diminish his authority. If anything, the intimacy of the setting made his power more apparent, more absolute. "Come here, boy," he said, without looking up from his scroll. His voice was neither harsh nor kind, merely matter-of-fact. The tone he might use to summon a servant or call a dog. Ganymede approached slowly, unsure how close he was expected to. "Come," stopping just beyond arm's reach, until Lucullus gestured for him to move closer. "Turn around," he commanded, and Ganymede obeyed, moving slowly so he could be examined from all angles. Lucullus's eyes assessed him with the same thoroughness he had shown at the slave market, noting the effects of weeks of careful grooming and training. When he nodded approval, Ganymede felt a confusing mixture of relief and shame, grateful to have passed his inspection, yet horrified that his worth depended solely on his aesthetic satisfaction. Learning quickly, Lucullus continued, setting down his wine and giving Ganymede his full attention. "Recite something for me, something Greek. I'm in the mood for philosophy." Ganymede began a passage from Plato's Symposium, chosen because it was beautiful, and he had memorized it perfectly. As he spoke, he watched Lucullus's face for signs of pleasure or displeasure, modulating his voice according to the master's expressions. When Lucullus smiled slightly at a particularly elegant phrase, Ganymede felt a surge of pride that immediately disgusted him. He was learning to find satisfaction in his master's approval, exactly as his training intended. "Lovely," Lucullus said. When he finished, "Your accent needs work, but that will come with time. Sit beside me. No, closer than that. I want to feel your warmth while I read." The next hour passed in a strange kind of intimacy that bore no resemblance to any relationship. Ganymede had known. He sat perfectly still while Lucullus read, occasionally stroking his hair absently as one might pet a favorite cat. Sometimes Lucullus read passages aloud, testing Ganymede's comprehension with questions that probed both his intelligence and his training. When he gave answers that pleased his master, the touch became more affectionate. When he failed to understand something, Lucullus's attention withdrew, and Ganymede learned to dread that withdrawal more than any physical punishment. This became the insidious pattern of his new existence. Days blurred into weeks, then months, then years, each one a repetition of training and preparation. Each evening punctuated by the summons to his master's private chambers, Ganymede's existence became a meticulously choreographed dance of compliance and performance. Sometimes, the companionship Marcus Lucullus desired was intellectual. Discussions of philosophy or poetry, where Ganymede was expected to be engaged, yet never challenging. Learn to artfully parry questions, to offer insights that flattered, without usurping, to display intelligence, without ever threatening his master's intellectual superiority. Sometimes, it was purely aesthetic. Ganymede served as living decoration while Lucullus entertained guests, silent testament to his refined taste and unlimited resources. He was a beautiful, educated ornament, proof of his master's wealth and discernment. And sometimes, the service was more intimate in ways that his previous life in the Celtic hills had provided no context for understanding. He learned that his body, like his mind, existed solely for his master's pleasure. The beautiful rooms, the expensive education, careful grooming, all of it was part of a meticulously designed system to make him a more satisfying possession. It was not a person who happened to be owned. It was an object crafted specifically. For his master's use, the psychological impact proved more devastating than any physical abuse. Slowly, insidiously, Ganymede began to lose track of where his performance ended and his identity began. The mannerisms he had learned to please his master became automatic, ingrained in his very being. The interests Lucullus had cultivated in him, a love for Greek poetry, a nuanced understanding of Roman history, started to feel genuinely his own, blurring the lines of forced indoctrination. Most disturbing of all, he sometimes caught himself feeling genuine affection for the man who had stripped away his freedom and reshaped him according to his desires. It was a terrifying realization, a testament to the insidious power of the system he was trapped within. Other boys in the household found different ways to survive, each carving out their own desperate niche within the gilded cage. Alexis, the Syrian boy, had become a master manipulator, playing on their master's emotions with such frightening skill that he had achieved a position of relative security. He whispered secrets to Ganymede about managing Lucullus's shifting moods, about subtle ways to encourage his generosity, about techniques for remaining valuable as physical beauty inevitably faded. The key, Alexis explained during a rare private moment, his dark eyes shrewd, is to make yourself indispensable for more than just your looks. Learn his business interests so you can provide useful insights. Become skilled at managing the household so he depends on your efficiency. Cultivate relationships with his important guests so he values your social utility. Beauty fades, Ganymede, but usefulness can last for years. Dionysius, on the other hand, represented a different, chilling survival strategy: complete surrender. He had erased himself so thoroughly that he no longer seemed to experience wants or fears or hopes. He responded to commands with perfect, ghostly obedience, provided whatever service was required, and existed in a state of such complete submission that resistance had become literally unthinkable to him. In some ways he seemed content, but his contentment was the unsettling peace of death, not life. Ganymede tried to find a middle path between Alexis's calculated manipulation and Dionysius's spiritual suicide. He performed his role with skill meticulously, but tried to maintain some inner core of self that remained untouched by his brutal circumstances. It was harder than he had ever imagined. The system was designed to make resistance not just difficult, but incomprehensible. When every aspect of your existence depended on pleasing your master, when your very sense of worth had been rebuilt around his approval, the very concept of independent thought became alien, almost painful. Months passed, then years. His body began showing the first subtle signs of approaching manhood, a deepening voice that had to be disguised with careful breath control, muscle development that required increasingly drastic dietary restrictions to maintain the desired androgynous, form facial hair that demanded daily meticulous removal. Each change brought a fresh wave of anxiety about his continued usefulness and value. The household dynamics shifted with brutal regularity. New boys arrived, terrified and raw, while older ones subtly disappeared. Ganymede witnessed the entire horrifying cycle: the terror of fresh arrivals, the gradual, insidious adaptation to their circumstances, the careful maneuvering for position and favor, and finally, the inevitable disposal when youth faded beyond concealment. Some boys were sold to other households, passed on like worn-out tools. Others were manumitted with small pensions, a false promise of freedom that often led to destitution. A few simply vanished without explanation, swallowed by the vast, indifferent machinery of Rome. He developed complex relationships with his fellow captives. There was genuine friendship, mixed with bitter competition, mutual support, shadowed by the knowledge that any of them might be sacrificed to preserve the other's positions. They shared techniques for survival, warned each other about their masters, changing moods, and provided comfort during the inevitable moments of despair, a silent brotherhood of the enslaved. But they also competed for favor, knowing that being the preferred boy meant better treatment and greater, albeit temporary, security. The outside world existed, but remained largely irrelevant to his daily existence. He heard faint news of military campaigns, political developments, social changes, but these events felt as distant and ethereal as mythology. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of the villa, and his concerns had narrowed to the immediate, agonizing requirements of survival within that confined, opulent space. Occasionally, glimpses of his former life surfaced unbidden. The sharp scent of bread baking might trigger a searing memory of his mother's kitchen, warm and comforting. A merchant's gruff accent could echo his father's voice. These moments brought such intense, acute pain that he learned to suppress them immediately. Focusing instead on the present reality that defined his existence, a present he could, perhaps, control. His master aged too, though far more gradually and comfortably than his possessions. Gray appeared in his hair, lines developed around his intelligent eyes. His body thickened with continued prosperity. But these changes didn't threaten his position or security. If anything, they enhanced his gravitas and social standing. Age brought him wisdom and respect, while it brought Ganymede only the approaching terrifying end of his usefulness. The realization that his time was limited created a strange urgency in his daily existence. Every successful performance felt like a temporary stay of execution. Every sign of his master's continued satisfaction became precious, a fragile lifeline. He found himself grateful for small kindnesses, a gentle touch, a moment of genuine conversation. An expensive gift, even though he understood that these gestures reflected his master's attachment to a prized possession, not a recognition of his humanity. Some boys cracked under this relentless pressure, becoming increasingly desperate in their attempts to remain valuable. They volunteered for more degrading services, competed more viciously with their fellow captives, or simply broke down entirely under the stress of maintaining an impossible standard of perfection. Others, like Ganymede, learned a kind of stoic acceptance, performing their role with professional competence while trying to preserve some small, irreducible sense of dignity. A flicker of the self that was kiss. The system's most insidious aspect was how it made its victims complicit in their own exploitation. Ganymede became skilled at anticipating his master's desires, even feeling a perverse pride in his ability to provide satisfaction. Competitive with other boys for the privilege of serving, the training was so thorough that he internalized not just the behaviors, but the very values of his captors. Measuring his worth by their standards and finding identity in their approval, years of this existence created a kind of Stockholm syndrome, so complete that freedom became not just impossible, but utterly unimaginable. When he occasionally heard stories of slaves who attempted escape, his first reaction wasn't admiration, but puzzlement. Where would they go? How would they survive? What identity could they claim outside the roles they had been trained to fill? The system didn't just imprison his body, it colonized his imagination, making alternatives to captivity literally unthinkable. Yet, even within this total system, small, defiant acts of resistance remained possible. Ganymede retained fragments of his original Celtic language, though he never spoke it aloud, a secret solace. He preserved carefully guarded memories of his family, though he rarely allowed himself to access them, for the pain was too profound. Most importantly, he maintained a fragile flicker of awareness that his current existence was not his only possible identity, that another self, Kais, still existed beneath the polished veneer of Ganymede, even if he couldn't imagine any practical alternative. The very knowledge of this deeper self was a form of defiance. The end, when it finally came, arrived with the same casual efficiency that had marked his beginning in this life. His master's interests had subtly shifted toward younger acquisitions, and Ganymede's approaching physical maturity made him less suitable for the delicate role he had filled for so long. There was no dramatic confrontation, no emotional farewell, just a quiet, almost clinical conversation with Alexandros about his future placement. "The master has arranged for your manumission," Alexandros explained, with the detached professionalism that had characterized every aspect of Ganymede's training. "You'll receive a modest inheritance and recommendations for employment in a senatorial household. Your education and deportment make you suitable for administrative or tutorial positions." Irony was bitter, a cold, sharp taste in his mouth. His exploitation had equipped him with skills that made him valuable in the legitimate world, but only because those skills were developed through years of systematic abuse. His education in languages, literature, and social graces opened doors. Yet each opportunity reminded him of how he had acquired these qualifications. His perfect manners and instinctive deference to authority made him an ideal subordinate. Yet these traits were beaten into him through relentless psychological conditioning. Freedom, when it came, felt less like liberation than displacement. After years of having every moment structured and every decision made for him, the responsibility of independent choice proved overwhelming. He had been trained to anticipate others' desires so thoroughly that identifying his own wants became nearly impossible. The world outside the villa was vast and full of possibilities, but he lacked the internal framework for navigating it as a free agent. The other boys he left behind represented all the paths he might have taken. Some would adapt successfully to their new circumstances, finding ways to transform their survival skills into legitimate success, blending into the tapestry of Roman society. Others would struggle with the transition, unable to function without the rigid structure that had defined their existence, adrift in a world too big for them. A few, like Alexandros, would never truly leave at all, aging into positions of authority within the same system that had shaped them, becoming part of the machinery. As he walked away from the villa for the last time, a new tunic on his back, a small purse in his hand. He carried with him not just the skills and knowledge that would define his future, but the scars, visible and invisible, that would never fully heal. His story joined the thousands of similar stories that Rome's proud historians chose not to record. Voices silenced by a civilization that preferred to remember its glory rather than confront its profound shame. The empire that created this system eventually fell, but not before generations of boys like him passed through its elaborate machinery of desire. Their names are forgotten, their individual experiences dismissed as mere footnotes to grander narratives of conquest and cultural achievement. But their suffering was real, their resilience remarkable, and their stories deserve to be remembered as more than just the price paid for Roman luxury. In the end, Ganymede, the boy who was Cais, became both victim and survivor, shaped by forces beyond his control, but not entirely defined by them. The boy who was taken from a Celtic hillside, and the man who eventually walked free from a Roman villa were connected by an unbroken thread of identity that no amount of training, no amount of conditioning could completely sever. That thread, thin as it sometimes became, represented the irreducible core of human dignity that even the most sophisticated systems of exploitation cannot entirely destroy. The marble halls are empty now. The golden doors have crumbled. The empire that normalized such exploitation has long since fallen to dust. But in remembering these forgotten voices, and acknowledging the human cost of what history often celebrates as civilization's achievements, we honor not just their suffering, but our own responsibility to recognize similar patterns wherever they emerge in our own time. The faces change, the methods evolve, but the fundamental dynamic remains: those with power finding ways to exploit those without it. Particularly when innocence, youth, and beauty are involved, their secret lives were never truly secret. They were simply ignored by those who preferred not to see. In telling their stories now, we ensure that their suffering was not entirely meaningless. And perhaps, in some small way, we help prevent others from walking down those same torchlit corridors, toward doors that should never open for children at all.